Now, I want to kind of end just on just a couple of the themes I think that will matter if you want to get on track for this stuff. And this is the stuff that I think with the Centre for Public Policy that we can focus on and think about. There's many, many ways to think about this. So we've already talked about the kind of grand politics of climate in this country. We haven't talked in that, and we won't have time today to talk about the interaction between UK and Scottish politics, but that is a very big factor in all of this. All the things I've just said about the 2030 target for UK are true with bells on for Scotland. Our 2030 target in Scotland is now on the cusp of being a ridiculous target because it is so far out of whack with where I think we are. The answer to that is actually to look beyond it, I think, and also to talk more deeply about how we cooperate between our governments in this country. But there's a host of other issues that I think really don't get enough attention. So let me just briefly talk about how the things that I at least think are important. So the first of these is about the economics. So the economics of net zero, I think, are amongst the most interesting things that we could look at. And the reason I say that is because there is huge progress in some of the key aspects of this transition taking place as we speak today. And what's driving a lot of the interest and the progress, if you work in economics, is this fundamental shift that we're seeing in the technologies that would take us to net zero, some of the energy technologies in particular. What we've seen in recent decades is an absolutely prodigious fall in the costs of the low carbon technologies that typically are electrical technologies, and renewables with it. The big ones are probably solar, wind, and also batteries, and you can see stunning cost falls in those technologies. If you look over the course of the same period at what's happened with the cost of fossil fuels, you'll see things going in the opposite direction. So there's lots of reasons to be optimistic about this transition if you think we can build systems of energy that are based around those technologies. Our assessment, again, what was in the pathway I've just shown you, is contained again in this chart. This is another version of looking at the same set of actions that you would see in that pathway. But this is looking, I think, fundamentally at something really interesting, is what would it require if we were investing across the country to achieve that overall. So again, this is work that we did in 2020, and we're going to look again at this. What this chart tells you is that we will need to invest more as a country than we would if we were not trying to hit net zero. Quite a bit more. So we'd be adding about, in this chart at least, about an eighth, possibly as much as a fifth, to the total capex across the whole economy that we do every year. So that takes you to a figure of somewhere between 50 and 60 billion extra capex a year, most of that private sector. So this is capex from individuals and businesses mainly. That is a challenge. And some of the more nefarious voices in right-wing newspapers sometimes roll this number up and get to extremely large numbers and call it a cost. But it's not a cost, it's an investment. And I think there's a key difference here. So we are investing as a country in broadly these 5 things that you see here. It's about the transport system, it's about our buildings and the built environment, it's about the electricity sector especially, but also more broadly the energy sector. It's about networks, especially energy networks, and it's about industry. Most of the capex is in those 5 things. And the crucial point is that you can get a big number here, but you're only presenting that number in a truthful way if you net it off from what's below the line, which is the saving to the country that comes from using these capital assets that we are buying, investing in, and replacing fossil fuel versions that we use today. And you get this very big saving. Now, this was done in 2020. This is just us using things like electric vehicles, heat pumps, electrified plant and machinery in industry, and getting much lower operating costs from those technologies. This does not bring into play some of the really interesting bits of the brighter economic story of what might happen if you were to invest at that scale for that long. There are GDP multipliers that come from bringing back to the UK activity that presently we import when we follow this kind of pathway. We could be talking about things like reshoring industry in a world where you're doing this, because industry is very efficient and very cheap in this world. And there's a host of things kind of nestling in that stuff below the line that really, really matter that we're not counting in here, including notably the co-benefits to things like health that you can also measure and get to a really important number. If you net off that capex from the OPEX saving, you get to effectively a number of 0. So that was what we did in 2020. So net figure here, what we call the resource cost, is basically a zero cost to the economy over that period. And actually, the other interesting aspect of this is, slightly counterintuitive, as the fossil fuel price is high, or goes higher, the net saving is bigger. So that's us using fossil fuels less, also becoming more energy independent here in the UK. And we, of course, haven't looked at that. If we ran this today with the kind of fossil fuel prices we have today, you get a stonking saving across the whole economy, which is a really interesting condition for public policy and something that we will be thinking about when we come to do the next challenge. But before I'm accused of snake oil, that is the net position. So that's the aggregate position across the whole economy, and it is essentially meaningless to any one person in this country. No one experiences an aggregate position. And what's interesting is you have essentially, within this kind of net cost of zero, a huge distributional challenge. So how do you spread around the costs, and more importantly, I think from my perspective, how do you spread around the benefits as well? And what you get, this is one way of looking at that. Again, these net costs, CapEx minus OpEx, OpEx saving, you get this. So each of these charts in each sector, each bar is the net position in 2035 is the first bar, and the net position in 2050 is where we are in the second bar. This is just one aspect of the distributional challenge, but it shows you something I think quite interesting, that for some sectors you've got this net saving happening almost immediately. So surface transport is in that position today. Electric cars are super efficient. They use electricity that is pretty cheap. I'm an electric car driver myself. It is a cheaper thing to run that car. And that saving grows into the future. That's also true in the power sector. So we've got investment, in the short run that looks like a cost, but then that gives you this saving, and basically that's a cheaper energy system in 2050. But in other sectors, and most notably the industry sectors and in the building sector, you don't have that position playing out. So we're looking at an actual cost in those sectors that has to be borne by someone or something. And this, to me, I think is the issue. So if you want to see the biggest and stickiest of problems addressed, as I do, which is decarbonising buildings, we have to have policies that shelter people from some of these costs. Otherwise, you're asking the impossible of the people living and owning those houses, living in those houses and owning in those houses. Similarly, in industry, this is not something industry will do unless they are sheltered from some of those costs. Now, the benefit at the end of it is huge, but the policy challenge is real. And the other challenge, I suppose, that comes out of this is that this is a fiscal challenge that you could really grab, because you could spread some of the savings to pay for the costs in those sectors. So that is something that, no, I suspect not this Chancellor, but a future Chancellor, possibly the Chancellor in the next Parliament, will have to grapple with, particularly because tax revenues from transport are going to dwindle very, very quickly as we make this transition to electric cars. So this is one aspect of the distributional challenge. There are others. We can look across income distributions. That's a really interesting one. The other one is geographical distribution, which is something that we haven't got so much info on, but something I'm very keen that we work on. And the other one, I'm only going to deal with two today. The other one I think is really interesting is the challenge of the workforce change that comes with this, the skills and the jobs challenge. It is often said that we need green jobs. And I was talking at a thing yesterday where I was reflecting on the fact that I just think there's a load of rubbish talked about green jobs. I'd rather we just had jobs, and jobs that are going to normalise this transition as much as possible. And that might seem like a controversial thing to say, but I think that's the only way this will work. People need to work on net zero without thinking every day, I'm on net zero, I'm in a net zero job. So this is one way of just kind of conceptualizing that. So you've got a set of jobs that are what you might think of as grow jobs. So we've got a sort of workforce that in areas where we might grow, ones that will need to transition, and ones that need to adjust. And we've got within that these kind of categories that you can see here of areas where we know we're going to get growth in jobs, areas where that's more conditional on policy especially, areas where the sector can certainly thrive but it's going to have to redirect itself. The red one in the middle is the controversial one. That's those areas where you know that the sector just can't exist in a net zero environment. And those other ones here, they're more peripheral or enabling, typically things in the service sector. So one interesting thing is, where do you think we are on this? What is the kind of proportion of the workforce in each of these categories? And at the back, you may not be able to see this, but don't worry. It's really interesting. We did this work, and the main finding of it was that most people won't see any difference at all in their job. So, most of the people working today are in what we've got as peripheral, 60% of them. And that makes sense if you think it through. Most of us are not in kind of fossil fueled industries directly. We've got a lot of growth. You can see that in the top corner there. And the really interesting stuff is really where you've got conditional growth. That is, if you put a policy in place, you'll get that growth in jobs. Or where we see these transitions taking place, that, where essentially you need to prepare a sector for the transition and prepare it to move if you can. And I think most interesting of all for me is that not just that 60% of the present workforce in our estimation are not going to be affected by this, but only 0.3% of the workforce is in what you might think of as a phased down sector. And that's basically the kind of the hardcore oil and gas extractive industries. And that's a sector you can prepare a lot of ways in which you can plan for that effectively overall. But beware, again, not being accused of snake oil, there's more than that going on. It's easy to tell a good story of green jobs and job growth, but the geography of it really matters. And you do see this thing that in those areas where we're expecting job growth, it tends to be geographically dispersed. So the biggest area of job growth is actually in the construction sector or in the building retrofit sector. This is about insulating buildings, putting in heat pumps. That's right across the country. That's what you see on the right of this chart. Where you've got jobs in fossil fuels, they tend to be geographically specifically located. So you get this kind of highly concentrated impact, even though those sectors are small in number in terms of the overall proportion of people working in the UK, they are concentrated in places like the northeast of Scotland. So you've got real challenges here, and I don't want to duck that. I think the other thing I'll say about this is that for some sectors, it's quite an interesting question of the pace of the transition itself. And there's a question here about industrial policy too. For a sector like heat pumps, we know that will grow continuously and gradually over time. You don't need to act now to land that kind of supply chain here in the UK. For something like electric vehicles, the production of those electric vehicles, those production lines, or something like decarbonised heavy industry, steel, for example, you've got to act now if you want to land it, because the investment cycles are long. If you don't land a new supply chain and production line here in this country now, within the next kind of 5 years, it will be somewhere else. And I think that's a kind of really interesting challenge overall, which isn't really being talked about in the story of industrial policy and this interaction with net zero. You see some of that playing out with the steel story in the UK at the moment. All right, I'm almost done. Now, who said this? No one in Westminster politics has yet had the courage to look people in the eye and explain what's really involved. That was the Prime Minister. So that was a quote from his speech in Downing Street. And I absolutely agree with him, actually. I think it is broadly true. There are some very good politicians who work on climate who have had the courage to talk about it. But I'm not sure you need courage to talk about it. You just need clear sight. I showed you this quote because it was the bit that I sparked on when I heard him deliver the speech. Because I don't think he's levelling with the country either, actually, in the things that he said about net zero. The most challenging bit of all for me about the speech was presenting net zero solely as a cost. This idea that this was something he needed to protect the country from was very much the sort of theme of that speech. And that, of course, is not true. It is a policy choice to do that. You can protect the people living in this country from any aspect of this transition as long as you choose to do so. So I think the kind of key thing for me is, can we get to a point where we have a more honest discussion about this, which is exactly what I think we should do. And let me start with one area where I feel we've just not had that honest discussion recently. So again, a chart I used in my talk yesterday. This is looking at North Sea gas production projections from the authority that looks over that, the North Sea Transition Authority. It used to be the Oil and Gas Authority. And I've only recently come into possession of this chart. It's a really great thing. This shows you what we're expecting from production without any development of new fields. So this is just the gas story. It's a similar shaped story for oil. There is more oil. This is a 97% reduction in gas production between now and 2050. So that is what the NSTA themselves are projecting. This is what happens if you sweat those assets where we know there is undeveloped discoveries and a license is in place. So you get this kind of sliver on top of that. And this is the thing that we've been debating incredibly intensely over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. It's tiny. It's absolutely tiny. In fact, what it results in is a 95% reduction by 2050 rather than 97% reduction. Now, British politics has been gummed up in the red bit of that chart for the last 12 to 18 months. And my view of this is it's a complete distraction. I myself have found myself gummed up in it because I don't actually know what to say when a journalist asks me what I think about that red sliver of the chart. What I really want to say is let's talk about something else, because that's what really matters. This is a transition that's going to happen anyway. And the reason it's going to happen anyway is because of geology. It's not because of politics. So what's interesting for me, coming back to the story of public politics, is that we are in a bit of the world, whether that's UK or Scotland, that will have to achieve a transition away from fossil fuels in broadly the same timescales as the world needs to achieve the transition to net zero. We don't have to have the very difficult discussion that petrostates have about what you do afterwards and don't bring it out of the ground because there won't be anything left. So we should move on from this discussion into the stuff that I've been talking about today, the hard stuff of how you get the country on to the challenge of net zero, which is fascinating and inspiring and all the good stuff that comes with that. And these are my final things to show you today. I don't think we're very good at leveling with the public on this stuff, but I think we've been better in the past. So my friend and colleague Keith Bell, who sits on my committee, gave me these adverts, which are from the 1960s. And if you see me present this, that's fine. I make no apology for them. I think they're brilliant. So this is from Country Life magazine. I don't know if you have any Country Life readers in the room, but this is Country Life magazine from the 1960s. And this was the last time we tried to do something, I think, really hard with our energy system. So this was about upgrading the voltage of the power system back in the 1960s. And I love this because it completely confronts it. This is the CEGB, as they're called. They're the nationally owned Central Electricity Generation Board. We don't have a nationally owned thing quite like it now, but we do have a government and a set of institutions that need to do exactly the same thing, essentially put stuff in the ground and confront difficult decisions about where to put it. And it's particularly about the planning regime. And I'll just end on this one because it's the one I like most. By the time these children are 10 years older, Britain's power demands will have doubled, but the number of transmission towers will not have doubled. And it explains really clearly why we're doing this, what benefit there is to the country, and it doesn't duck the fact that this is actually difficult stuff. And I think my kind of final point on all this is that unless we get to that kind of discussion on this, we're not going to make much more progress on this story of net zero, because the next set of challenges are not like decarbonising the power system. You can do that without many people noticing. You do need to upgrade buildings in this country. We need to change the transport system. We've got to confront things like low carbon farming, changes in consumption, changes in industry that go with this. We can do all of that. We know how to do it, but we're not going to be able to do it unless we have this kind of grown-up discussion about it, and unless we grow up our politics around that too. And I hope that the Centre for Public Policy will do just that. So thank you very much.